Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents The Unraveling, High Hopes and Missed Opportunities in Iraq by Emma Skye. Narrated by Henrietta Meire. Preface. Nothing that happened in Iraq after the overthrow of Saddam Hussein in 2003 was preordained, and there was nothing inevitable about the way the story unfolded. This memoir recounts my experiences in Iraq over more than a decade. My story starts when I responded to the British government's request for volunteers to help rebuild the country after the fall of the regime, and found myself responsible for Kirkuk, trying to diffuse tensions between the different Iraqis scrambling to control the province. It continues through the surge when I served as a political advisor to General Odierno, goes through the drawdown of US troops, and ends with the takeover of a third of Iraq by the Islamic State. It is a tale of unintended consequences, both of President Bush's efforts to impose democracy and of President Obama's detachment, of action as well as non-action. The Unraveling describes the challenges of nation-building and how the overthrow of an authoritarian regime can lead to state collapse and conflict. It reminds us of the limitations of external actors in foreign lands, but also where we can have influence. Those the US-led coalition excluded from power sought to undermine the new order that was introduced, and those we empowered sought to use the country's resources for their own interests, to subvert the nascent democratic institutions, and to use the security forces we trained and equipped to intimidate their rivals. There was more the US could have done to help broker a deal among the elites and to ensure the peaceful transfer of power through elections. Instead, the US took the risky gamble of betting on Nouri al-Maliki in the mistaken belief that he shared the same interests and goals as us, and that he would use the dramatic decline in violence brought about during the surge to build up a sovereign, self-reliant, and democratic Iraq. The failure of this policy became only too apparent when the Islamic State, Daesh, catapulted to prominence in June 2014, taking control of vast swathes of Iraqi territory and presenting itself as a defender of Sunnis against the Iranian-backed Shia-led regime in Baghdad, and when the Iraqi security forces deserted and dissolved. President Barack Obama became the fourth American president to order airstrikes on Iraq, following in the footsteps of George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and George W. Bush. The initial airstrikes were to stop Daesh from exterminating Iraq's minorities and taking over Erbil. However, following the beheadings of 2 American hostages by Daesh, the US quickly expanded its airstrikes into Syria. Americans were no longer war-weary. They were scared again and wanted retribution. Never had Obama expected to find himself in such a position. He had campaigned for president, pledging to end the Iraq War. In 2009, still in his first year in office, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his extraordinary efforts to strengthen international diplomacy and cooperation between peoples. Obama, who had presented himself as the president who would extract America from its foreign entanglements and focus on nation-building at home, has reluctantly taken the country back to war in the Middle East, with no sense of how it will end. Daesh is the hideous product of a sacralized determinism born out of secular failure. The dramatic changes in the regional balance of power in Iran's favor, brought about not least by the Iraq War, and the deep social, economic and political problems in the Arab world, which sparked the Arab Spring, have convinced some Sunnis that we live in an ungodly age of political injustice, where suffering, terror and armed conflict are the true tests of righteousness and will be rewarded. Others simply want revenge for what they see as Iranian triumphalism and Sunni humiliation. Regional actors, state and non-state, have sought to project their influence and mobilize the faithful by supporting sectarian actors in different countries, and many Arab governments remain incapable of responding to the demands of their increasingly young and interconnected populations. Daesh feeds on a Sunni sense of disenfranchisement and grievance and claims to offer a better future in the form of an idealized past, an unmoored, postmodern caliphate with globalized ambitions and a new territorial base. The rise of Daesh, the successor to al-Qaeda in Iraq, and the sectarianization of conflict in the region as symptoms of highly complex and intractable pathologies in the Middle East. They show that ideas matter, but if the very conditions that gave rise to Daesh are not addressed, then its ideology will continue to attract adherents, and it will likely be succeeded sometime in the future by son of Daesh, and the cycle will continue. The Unraveling is essentially the story of women and men, of Iraqis and Americans, of soldiers and civilians, ordinary and yet extraordinary, whose lives became so entwined in the land between the two rivers. It is a story I have chosen to share to honour the efforts of those who strived, to remember the lives that were lost, and to pay tribute to a broken country that I came so much to love. The Iraq War and its outcome affected few Americans. There is little willingness to really reflect on or take responsibility for what happened there. The legitimacy of the war was disputed right from the outset. Iraqis blame the US for destroying their country, and Americans blame Iraqis for not making use of the opportunity given to them. Politicians try to use the situation in Iraq for political advantage without much consideration of Iraqis themselves. Democrats blame Republicans for invading Iraq in the first place, and Republicans blame Democrats for not leaving troops there. The US military blames US government civilians for not doing enough, and the latter blames the former for trying to do too much. Brits blame Tony Blair. But what happened in Iraq matters terribly to Iraqis who hope so much for a better future, and to those of us who served there year after year. If we refuse to honestly examine what took place there, we will miss the opportunity to better understand when and how to respond to instability in the world. Iraq by Adnan Al-Sayegh. Translated by Sohail Najim. Iraq that is going away, with every step its exiles take. Iraq that shivers whenever a shadow passes. I see a gun's muzzle before me, or an abyss. Iraq that we miss, half of its history, songs and perfume, and the other half its tyrants. Prologue. The Iraq Inquiry. 14 January 2011. It was a chilly morning. I got off the number 87 bus at the House of Parliament and walked past Westminster Abbey, turning left down Great Smith Street. I was dressed in a suit for the first time in years. I had an appointment to appear before the Iraq Inquiry, also known as the Chilcot Inquiry. It was not a war crimes tribunal. No official in the UK or US would ever be held accountable for the decision to go to war in 2003, or the way in which the post-war phase was implemented. But it was an investigation into what had happened, in order to draw lessons for the future. Hundreds of officials had already given their testimony since the inquiry was established in mid-2009. Now, it was my turn. I entered a nondescript building. An official appeared, handed me a badge and showed me to the room. I was introduced to the commissioners, Sir John Chilcot, a career diplomat and senior civil servant, who chaired the inquiry, Baroness Usha Prashar, a member of the House of Lords, Sir Roderick Lyne, a former ambassador, and two historians, Sir Lawrence Freedman and Sir Martin Gilbert. I took my seat on one side of the table, facing my interrogators. I felt slightly apprehensive, but I kept telling myself that nothing could faze me after my Iraq experience. No one was going to die. Baroness Prashar, can we start with some background information first? Can you describe how you were recruited to work for the CPA, Coalition Provisional Authority? Emma Skye. There was an email that was sent around the civil service asking for people to volunteer to go and work for the CPA. It was going to be Brits and Americans administering the country. I wasn't in the civil service. I was in the British Council. The email was forwarded to me. I expressed interest and became a second D to the FCO, Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and then on to the CPA. Baroness Prashar. And what briefing were you given before you went to Iraq? Emma Skye. I was not given a briefing. There was a phone call. It basically said, you've spent a lot of time in the Middle East, you will be fine. Turn up at RAF Bryce Norton. As soon as you get to Basra, there will be somebody to meet you. They will be standing there with a sign with your name on it, and they will take you to the nearest hotel. Baroness Prashar. But apart from a phone call, were you given any information about the Security Council Resolution 1483 and its implications for serving in the CPA? Emma Skye. I don't recall receiving any. Baroness Prashar. It would be helpful if you can just describe what your role and responsibilities were during your period at the CPA. Emma Skye. The CPA looked at the country as 15 provinces plus Kurdistan, so in each of the 15 provinces they had a senior civilian, who was known as the governorate coordinator, and assumed the role a governor would play, responsible for the administration of the province, working with the US military, working with Iraqis, finding local leaders, working out who could take what responsibilities, building up their capacity to govern the province themselves. Baroness Prashar. And what were your specific responsibilities? What were you tasked to do? Emma Skye. There was no job description. We weren't given outlines of what our jobs were. I don't recall receiving an outline of what my job was until maybe September, so up until then it was really how I interpreted what my role should be. Sir Roderick Lyne. I just wonder if I can come back to the beginning of this conversation just to make sure I've really understood it. When you went out there, you say you had no written briefing, no terms of reference, no instructions, and you did not have any oral briefing from anybody other than to turn up at Brize Norton and fly out to Basra. Emma Skye. No. Sir Roderick Lyne. Nothing at all. Emma Skye. No, not before I left the UK. I don't recall any at all except the one phone call. When I got to Basra, obviously there was no one there with a sign with my name on it, nor a hotel, so I went on to Baghdad. I made my way to the palace, and there I met the British team. I spent a week going around the palace, seeing how things worked, getting as many briefings as I could. They said, "We have enough people here. We don't have enough people in the north. Go north." So I went to Mosul. They said, "We've got someone here." I went to Erbil. They said, "We've got someone here but haven't got anyone in Kirkuk." So I went to Kirkuk. I didn't know I was going to Kirkuk when I left the UK. Sir Roderick Lyne. So when you left the UK, you didn't know where you were going. You presumably didn't even know what kind of clothes to put in your suitcase. Emma Skye. Well, no. I was only going for 3 months. 3 hours after it had begun, the interrogation wound to a close. I looked towards Sir John Chilcot, hoping for some words of reassurance, willing him to recognise that despite the impossible challenge, I had tried my hardest in very difficult circumstances. Judging from Sir John's face, he was reeling from what I had told him. I had been opposed to the war, and naturally suspicious of the military, yet I had volunteered for 3 months to help get Iraq back on its feet, and within weeks of the fall of Saddam, I had found myself governing a province. By the time I left Iraq many years later, I had served as a political advisor to American generals through the surge and the drawdown of US troops. A British woman advising the top leadership of the US military. I suppose it must have seemed an unlikely story. Part 1. Direct Rule. June 2003 to June 2004. 1. To the Land of Two Rivers. All we are saying is give peace a chance. John Lennon. It was mid-morning on Friday 20th of June 2003. At the RAF base at Brize Norton, west of London, I stood waiting for the flight to Basra with 200 or so British soldiers. I was struck by how young and innocent they looked. Some were still pimply teenagers in clean and starched uniforms. Huddled together in their groups, a few stared at me, but most blanked me as if I did not exist. I felt quite out of place. I had never flown on a military plane before, and did not have a ticket. However, I was pleased to discover that my name was on some register, and that was all that mattered. I gave my rank as civilian, checked in my bag, and boarded. It was certainly a no-frills airline, with no seats assigned. During the flight, a soldier handed out packed lunches. I grabbed one and quickly ate the stale sandwich and chocolate bar. I tried to sleep, but I was both excited and apprehensive. I was being seconded to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office to help administer Iraq for a couple of months while the country got back on its feet. I was confident that the FCO knew what it was doing. I had just not yet been informed. The invasion had occurred 3 months previously, and the war was supposedly over. I was not unduly worried. At Basra International Airport, I wandered into the terminal and sat waiting for my bag. I looked around the airport, taking in the once grandiose and ornate interior, now damaged by war, looting, and neglect. Military Bergen rucksacks and guns wrapped up in canvas came round on the carousel, and then, a little incongruously, my bright purple backpack. I lifted it onto my back and headed off in search of customs. But there were none. No stamping of the passport, no entry visa, no Iraqis. I had been told that someone would be waiting for me, placard in hand, but nobody was. It didn't take me long to realize that no one was expecting me. The place was swarming with British soldiers who seemed to know where they were going. I went upstairs to where transit passengers were accommodated. It was a corridor from hell, 120 degrees Fahrenheit, no windows, no fans, no air conditioning, and fluorescent lighting which stayed on all night thanks to a generator. All along the corridor, male soldiers lay on cots and mats stripped down to their underwear. I did not think that was an option for me, nor did I have a sleeping mat. I stretched my towel out on the concrete and lay down on top of that. Some of the soldiers were already snoring away, but I got little sleep. In the morning I lined up for the porta-johns, went to the communal shower, which had no water, and sat down to eat breakfast. My first meal in Iraq was a meal ready to eat, US military rations that British soldiers had acquired to break up the monotony of their own. I followed the instructions carefully: open packet, take out contents, fill bag with cold water up to the level mark, put back silver packet, fold bag at top and wait. Sure enough, the bag began to heat up, cooking the contents of the silver packet, and within 10 minutes I was tucking into tortellini. Not the first breakfast I expected to eat in Iraq, but I was starving. I decided to head for Baghdad in the hope that someone there was expecting me and had a job for me to do. I hitched a lift on the RAF C-130 Hercules. For a civilian, this was an experience in itself. Military flights were basic. There was no protection from the temperature or the noise. I strapped myself into one of the seats that ran alongside the frame of the plane and hung my arms through the red meshing behind me, keeping my limbs away from my body in an attempt to cope with the heat. I listened intently to the safety instructions barked out by one of the RAF crew, pointing at the different doors. If we crash into the sea, you go out that exit. If we crash on land, you go out this exit. I really thought we were crashing when the plane descended rapidly in a spiral. The pull of gravity left my whole body feeling it was being violently compressed. I was later told that this was a corkscrew landing to avoid being hit by missiles. I arrived at Baghdad International Airport at around midday. Emerging from the plane, it felt as if a hairdryer on its hottest setting was being thrust in my face. Respite from the scorching heat was provided in a large air-conditioned tent where some US soldiers sat around watching television. The BBC was running a Great Britain series. Featured that day was Princess Diana. After hours of waiting, I got on a military bus that took me the half-hour ride to the Republican Palace, now the headquarters of the CPA. After empty wasteland, the airport road passed houses set back from the road and hidden by palm trees. I did not see any Iraqis, but for the US military presence, I might have been arriving in Amman in the heat of the summer midday, when everyone was taking siesta. At the palace I reported to the British office, which was staffed by British diplomats. My name was on the list of secondees, and they had been expecting my arrival. A British colonel welcomed me warmly. There was nothing to worry about, he said, except for trigger-happy Americans. That was the main threat to Brits. I wandered around the huge palace, seeking to learn its mysteries. Originally built for King Faisal II, it was renamed the Republican Palace after the king's assassination in the 1958 coup. The palace had been spared in the shock and awe bombardment of Baghdad. What was dubbed the Green Zone was now developing around it. In one of the great rooms, the domed ceiling was covered with a painting of the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem and flying horses, while one wall had a massive mural of Scud missiles pointing to the sky. Saddam Hussein's name and initials were engraved on every wall. I stepped outside and looked up. 4 huge bronze busts of Saddam's head adorned the palace roof. US engineers were considering how to decapitate them. Life in the Republican Palace in those early days was extraordinary. It was a swarming mass of soldiers with a smattering of civilians. Offices had been set up all over the palace, but their location constantly moved. Signs would appear on doors announcing the new incumbents, with directions to the former office now in some other part of the palace. There was no air conditioning, the electricity was erratic, and the water system was frequently down. Stately rooms and corridors had become dormitories reminiscent of wartime hospitals. The lucky ones found fans to blow the sweat across their bodies when the electricity came on. There were no toilets or showers in operation inside the palace. We traipsed to the facilities that had been set up outside the palace's back door. The shower block had certain hours designated for women and other hours for men. At times we showered with mineral water, and some days even the floors were washed with mineral water. The porta-johns were regularly full to the bursting point, with the stench vomit-inducing. I found a bed upstairs in the palace in a room where 2 other women were sleeping. However, within days, a sign on the door informed us that the room was now an office. I managed to get a room in the nearby Al Rashid Hotel by persuading someone who was leaving not to check out and to give me their key. It was an 18-story concrete building within the green zone. There were no longer any signs of the mosaic of President George H.W. Bush's face, which had been installed in the floor of the lobby following the First Gulf War, so that every visitor would trample over it as they entered. It had been dug up a few weeks before by U.S. soldiers. Life support was provided by Kellogg Brown & Root, KBR, a subsidiary of Halliburton, the U.S. multinational that specialized in oil field services. KBR was responsible for feeding us, for sending our laundry to Kuwait for cleaning, and for all the other tasks which are required to keep an army up and running. The former ballroom was now the canteen, or chow hall facility. 3 times a day I would queue along the side of the room, pick up a tray, plastic plate and plastic cutlery, choose between chicken and hamburger with freedom fries, renamed in reaction to France's opposition to the war, which were served by Pakistanis, collect a soda or sweet iced tea, and sit down at one of the tables to eat. Over the next few days, I was briefed by a series of army officers and diplomats about the CPA, the progress to date, and the challenges. I tried to get my head around the internal U.S. rivalries. I was told that the U.S. Department of Defense had set up the Office for Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance under the leadership of retired U.S. General J. Garner. But within days of Garner arriving in Iraq, the White House had grown nervous of his plans to hand over to a transitional Iraqi government and to hold elections within 90 days. They decided that they needed someone with greater political acumen, and on 11th May, Paul Bremer was appointed to head up the new CPA, subsuming the Office for Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance. Bremer did not believe there were credible Iraqi leaders who could assume power, and he decided that the CPA had to directly administer the country for an undefined period. America was going to rebuild Iraq, as it had rebuilt Germany and Japan after World War II. In order to overhaul the basis on which the state was run under Saddam, Bremer decreed that the CPA was dissolving the Ba'ath Party and disbanding the Iraqi security forces. But in so doing, the US was removing the sinews of the state that had held the country together. There was now a power vacuum and a free-for-all. While most Brits were based in Basra, a few were scattered in other provinces. I was told I was to be based in the north, and that I should travel there in a few days. I had now been in Iraq about a week, and had not spoken to a single Iraqi. I wanted to take a look at Baghdad before I headed north. The security situation had become a concern, and we were only supposed to leave the palace with an armed escort. But an opportunity came when an American general agreed to take me along with him to the Sheraton Hotel. At the hotel he shook my hand, wished me luck, and then turned a blind eye as I slipped through the security cordon, out past the concertina wire, and into the street. I found myself walking along the east bank of the river Tigris on Abu Nas Street, named after one of the greatest Arabic poets of the Islamic Golden Age, and a reminder that for several centuries, until the Mongol conquest of Baghdad in 1258, the city had been the cultural capital of the Arab world. I had no idea what modern-day Baghdad was supposed to look like. None of the city's former glory, fabled in the tales of the 1001 Nights, was visible among the rubbish strewn everywhere, the feral cats and the wild dogs. At the beginning of the 20th century, a third of the population of Baghdad had been Jewish. This land had once witnessed one of the world's most thriving Jewish communities. It was by the rivers of Babylon that Jews had once sat down and wept at the destruction of the Jewish temple. But the rise of Arab nationalism and the foundation of the State of Israel had led to the emigration of most of Iraq's Jews, and now fewer than a dozen remained. Spotting a sign for an art gallery, I went in. Iraqi art was renowned throughout the Middle East. "Salam alaikum," I said. "Alaikum salam," the man in the gallery responded. He was delighted to have a visitor. He introduced himself as the gallery owner and brought me a chai, tea served in a small glass with plenty of sugar. "I hid all the artwork in my home during the war," he told me. The coalition bombing had only targeted government installations. It was the Hawasim, which had come afterwards, that had concerned him. It took me a moment to understand that Hawasim referred to looters. Saddam had dubbed the US invasion Harb al-Hawazim, the final war, and had emptied the jails in the run-up to the war. The gallery owner had yet to put the paintings back on the walls, but he took me up some stairs to show me the piles of artwork that he had. "All Iraqis," he said, "are happy to see the end of Saddam." He went on, "But we are frustrated with the lawlessness and the lack of electricity and water." I had heard that every time the coalition repaired the infrastructure, saboteurs blew up installations and thieves pulled up the piping and stole the copper. "I want to reopen the gallery with an internet cafe," he told me, "but the problem is electricity." Continuing down the street, I came to a mosque and took my camera out. Seated behind a trolley in front of the mosque were 2 money changers with wads of Iraqi dinars set out in front of them. "Don't take pictures of the mosque," one of the men said. "Take a picture of this." He hitched up his dishdasher so that I could see his leg, amputated below the knee. This is what Saddam did. The horrors of the past were beginning to emerge: the mass murders, the ethnic cleansing, the torture, the fear that Iraqis had lived with for decades. I walked on. I stopped in front of what once would have been an ornate house. The gate was hanging off its hinges. It was as if a fierce storm had raged through the city, removing everything in its wake. But it was human hands that had gutted the building from top to bottom, leaving only the structure. An Iraqi man saw me staring at it. "This is Hobbesian world," he spat out in disgust, shaking his head. "Sorry?" I replied. "Hobbes, Hobbes," he repeated before walking off. His words reverberated in my head as I wandered back to my pick-up point at the Sheraton. Who was this Iraqi, and how did he know about Hobbes? After my induction in Baghdad, I boarded a US military C-130 and flew north up to Mosul and then on to Erbil, the seat of the Kurdistan regional government. At the Khansat Hotel, headquarters of CPA North, I met up with Leanne Saunders, a friend from Oxford who was in the Foreign Office and now the Deputy Regional Coordinator for CPA North. I was told I would be based in Kirkuk, but first I was to join the delegation of Ambassador Bremer for a tour of the North. I caught sight of Bremer on the helicopter pad. He appeared dashing and energetic, immaculately dressed in a suit, with the combat boots which came to be his signature. I thought he was in his mid-40s, until someone told me he was in his 60s. He was surrounded by bodyguards from Blackwater, a private security company. Travelling in Bremer's entourage had all the glamour and excitement of a presidential campaign trail. We flew by helicopter from Erbil to the city of Sulaymaniyah. It was my first time on a helicopter, and I was terrified I would throw up. Kurds turned out in great numbers to greet us with flowers and kisses, holding up placards thanking the US and the UK for liberating the Kurdish lands. The roads into town were lined with Peshmerga, Kurdish fighters who had fought alongside coalition troops. I accompanied Ambassador Bremer to his meeting with Jalal Talabani, the leader of the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, PUK. Bremer spoke about the new Iraq with passion and optimism. He discussed the establishment of a governing council for Iraq, which would consist of 25 Iraqis representing all communities and regions in the country. He said we were also looking to identify a group to draft the constitution, which would then be discussed across the country in various forums and put to a national referendum. Once approved, the constitution would pave the way for free and fair elections, giving the Iraqi people the opportunity to elect their own representatives. We flew on to the town of Sarirash, north of Erbil, where we had similar discussions with Masoud Barzani, the leader of the Kurdistan Democratic Party, KDP, the other main Kurdish political party. Bremer motioned for me, as a new arrival, to sit next to him at lunch, opposite Barzani. He asked me about myself and the work I had been doing before. I spoke about Palestine and Israel, of poverty elimination, and of justice reform around the world. Conversation then turned to the 4th of July, and Barzani and Bremer both looked at me, the Brit, for comment. I responded, "We wish all our former colonies the success of America." They beamed, and I thought to myself, how on earth had someone like me come to be part of this American-led occupation of Iraq? We celebrated America's Independence Day with the Kurds by the shores of Lake Dukan. It was apparently the largest lake in Kurdistan, created by the construction of a dam on the Little Zab River in the 1950s. I sat watching the sun set over the mountains. The Star-Spangled Banner was playing over the public address system. Baram Salih, the deputy leader of the PUK, made a rousing speech about
Sample complete. Ready to continue?